The end of a superpower? With America in decline, does the future now belong to China? And where do the world's emerging powers fit in the new pecking order? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Ghida Fakhry. On this new weekly program, we look at the shifting dynamics in a new world order that goes beyond the influence of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And we begin right here in Washington, D.C., where Donald Trump's America First policies, isolationism and withdrawal from multilateral agreements are undermining the United States' global standing. And with China on the rise, are we on the cusp of a new era?
The walls we are building are not medieval walls. They are smart walls. Until we can have a wall and proper security, we're going to be guarding our border with the military.
A very important space achievement for China. It became the first country ever to put a probe on the dark side of the moon.
At this very moment, large, well-organized caravans of migrants are marching toward our southern border. Some people call it an invasion. It's like an invasion.
I hope we could make a deal.
It's already challenging the US as the world's biggest economy, and now China is extending its strategic and commercial influence through the creation of a giant trading network known as the New Silk Road.
The obstructionist Democrats would like us not to do it, but believe me, we have to close down our government. We're building that wall.
China is leading the way in innovation. They're investing in computer science. They're investing in startups. And I think that's who we're going to see the challenges from in terms of who controls AI, transportation, all kinds of things that are critical. China is the competition.
And we're talking about national security. This isn't just a border. This is national security. This is health and wellness. This is everything.
So how well has the America First agenda served the United States? We're joined by Lewandowski, a former campaign manager for Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. Lewandowski, you are a strong supporter of the America First policy. You've said in the past that the US should not lead from behind the way the previous administration has done, that this president is leading the world, quote, as it's supposed to be done. How exactly is he leading the world when he is closing the US off, alienating it from many of its allies, isolating it, pulling out of many major international agreements, building a wall when others are actually building strategic alliances?
Well, look, first you have to ask, how is the U.S. leading? The U.S. is leading by going to our allies around the world and saying, we can't be not only the policeman of the world, but the piggy bank of the world. And what we've seen is $100 billion of more money into the international community from those countries around the world that weren't paying their fair share. And while the United States is a rich country, we're also a debtor country. We've got $22 trillion in debt.
Doesn't it mean that you're actually pursuing the wrong economic policies? Let's face it, President Trump wants to spend $21 billion on building the wall. That's according to the latest estimates by the National Homeland Security Department. Does it make sense to be spending so much on a wall, to be creating essentially a national emergency crisis when many people believe none exists?
Well, you have to ask yourself, what's the value of an American life? And if you want to ask Officer Singh, who was killed by a person who was deported multiple times, or Kate Steinle in California, and so many others, we could go through the stories.
Do you know as well as I do that the crime rate is down at the border? I mean,
that's not true.
Just look at the facts.
Today, let's look at the facts today.
I'll give you some of the facts. A study published in the journal Criminology shows that the more that undocumented immigrants are a share of the population, the less crime there is in the overall population.
If walls don't work, why did Syria and Turkey build around their own border?
Let me just mention this. Cato, a libertarian institute, says this. There is no justification to build a wall. In fact, they believe that crime is lower along the 23 counties along the US-Mexico border than it is inland.
That's absolutely not true. What we know for sure is that people come back and forth across the border illegally all the time. We know that they're deported. They make their way back to Mexico. They come back in and they kill Americans. Now, maybe that's acceptable in other countries, but we're a sovereign nation. And
Okay, well, you talk about global leadership, don't you? You've said that this president is exerting American dominance on the world stage and reminding everybody of how great a superpower we are. This is no longer a unipolar world, you'd agree. that the US controls. And if anything, Trump seems to be speeding up the US's global demise by chipping away at the established world order. Other countries are forging ahead. They're investing in renewable energy. They're investing in artificial intelligence. They are creating the kinds of alliances that push them forward politically, economically. Take China, take Russia.
Let's take China. They steal our intellectual property every chance they get, right? The reason that their market is now collapsing is because this president's been tough on China for the first time in a generation. We've got a $500 billion trade deficit with China alone on a yearly basis. And you know why? Because they don't give us access to their market share. When we do put American products there, you know what they do? They steal the intellectual property, they subsidize their own products, and they dump them on the U.S. soil at the cost of the American taxpayer. It's unacceptable. It's not fair, and we won't stand for it.
But again, that's not true.
It's
Trump
100%
slapped
true.
tariffs on China to reduce the trade deficit. That was one of his major campaign promises. He wanted to discourage the U.S. buyer from actually purchasing goods from China. The opposite happened. The latest data shows that the U.S. has been importing more, not less, from China. It also shows that the trade gap between the two widened last year by over $43 billion.
Of course it widened, because they still
Imports
don't
from
allow
China
our products
are
in.
actually increasing.
That's
U.S.
right.
exports are falling. How do you explain that?
Because Chinese companies are subsidized by the Chinese government. That's a fact. Look at the steel industry. Look at the aluminum industry. They are subsidized, and then what they do is they dump their products on U.S. soil. Think of major manufacturers of appliances that are made in China. They're dumped on our soil, and then you know what has to happen? We buy those products because Americans love cheap goods, and we can't compete.
So you're saying that the trade tariffs have failed?
No, what I'm saying is you have to let them work, and here's what we know. We're the hottest economy in the world right now. 6 million new jobs since the president's been elected. China's economy, where are they growing? 1.2, 1.3%. What's the growth rate of the American economy right now? Even in a bad time, our real wage growth is the highest it's been in 10 years, 3.4% real wage growth. If you look at it since Donald Trump's been in office, under Barack Obama, we were growing at 1.2. 1.3%.
Well, unemployment was already down under Obama in his last year. It was down to 4.8. Now it's gone down further under Trump. But that trend had begun under Obama.
It has nothing to do with Barack Obama. It's because the tax policies that this president has put in place to incentivize small and big businesses alike to reinvest into our country.
Well, let's talk about the U.S. as a superpower, because you say that we want to remind everybody of how great a superpower we are. How important is it then for the United States, for the word of this president, to be credible, to be taken seriously? Because the Washington Post counted at least 1,000 instances where this president lied. What has Trump done to make American foreign policy great again? Just give me one achievement.
The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Since this president has started having a conversation in North Korea, we have not seen one test-fired missile, unlike the previous administration, not once.
How then do you explain that on the heels of President Trump's visit to Hanoi and his meeting with Kim Jong-un, it was announced that actually the main rocket launch site has been rebuilt and that we are to expect another rocket launch anytime soon? So clearly Kim Jong-un doesn't think that Trump has been negotiating from a position of strength.
Since the president has started a discussion with North Korea, not one test-fired missile has been launched since the president met the first time in North Korea.
Let me take you up on another point you made. You said the U.S. is not interested in being the world's policeman. Why then is the U.S. intervening in Venezuela?
Well, look, there's two places. Venezuela and Syria both have brutal dictators that have used tactics. They've used weapons against their own people. And look, am I an interventionist? The answer is no. But sometimes when the U.S. is leading 50 countries around the world to ask for Maduro to step down and to leave and to go to a beach somewhere, that should take the world by notice, because we were the first country to call for that. It wasn't France, it wasn't Germany, it wasn't Great Britain. And when it came time to holding Bashar al-Assad accountable for chemical weapons and nuclear weapons.
On Syria, clearly this president has flip-flopped. 2 months ago he wanted U.S. troops to pull out immediately. Then it was let's have a gradual withdrawal. And now let's keep a few hundred people stationed there, soldiers. But let's really pick on what you said about Venezuela. I wonder how you count it an achievement to call on the democratically elected leader of a country to step down, to push for a military option if need be for regime change. I mean, certainly you would agree, but you've hinted at one.
We've used economic sanctions to hold him accountable.
Do you think it's any coincidence that Venezuela just happens to be sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the world?
The United States just today announced that we are now the largest oil exporter in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, we are the largest exporter of energy. So we don't care about Venezuela's oil. It has nothing to do with oil.
Even if that is true, the price of oil is an international one. So whoever controls oil fields in the world matters greatly, doesn't it? Let me just ask you this. You've said many times in the past and here today that President Trump cares about America's interests. When you look at climate change, is he really putting America first? Because just looking again at the recent surveys, 69% of Americans say that they are worried about global warming. In fact, a growing number of Americans, including most Republicans, now say that they believe that climate change is happening, which is a clear shift. Can you deny that this president is out of step with a good chunk of the electorate in this country?
That's not true. See, here's the thing. The great thing about statistics are you can use them any way you want, but the reality is at the ballot box. And if you were going to present me a series of facts and statistics the day before the election, you would have all but assured me Hillary Clinton was going to win a record landslide. But the truth was, Donald Trump won the largest margin of the Electoral College since Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign in 1988. So every statistic was wrong. Every polling data was wrong. So I don't believe your polling data. I don't believe that 69.
It's American polling data, and I think it's credible enough.
Which polling company?
Many of them.
Which one?
Ipsos, for one. I mean, that's a credible polling company.
The same one that said Donald Trump would lose by 7 points?
Well, if it didn't suit your purposes, doesn't mean it's not credible, is it? Let me just ask you finally about these new moves within Congress, certainly among Democratic members of Congress, who are pushing for the impeachment of this president. Do you think this is something that is likely to happen, and how do you see President Trump doing in the next 2 years?
No, I think the Democrats will absolutely move to impeach President Trump. It will be, they will have that recourse at the ballot box in 2020. There is nothing to impeach him for other than fighting for America and putting America first. If that's a crime, then guilty as charged.
Cory Lewandowski, thank you very much indeed. And still ahead on the program, has the United States lost its superpower status? And who will fill the leadership void? America's position as the world's leading economy is being challenged by several Asian countries, with China soon poised to overtake the United States. New emerging economies like India and Indonesia are also expected to be among the world's top 4 by 2030. So will the race among nations be determined by the size of their economy, their military, their geostrategic alliances, or something entirely different? Anna Rold, publisher of the Diplomatic Courier and professor at Northeastern University, gives us her take in The Big Idea.
My belief is that the new geopolitical struggle is going to be completely in the digital sphere. Whether that's AI, blockchain, cryptocurrency, any of the new emerging technologies, whoever has figured out how to use those new technologies in the physical realm is going to get ahead of the game in the new pecking order. Think about it in terms of the moonshot. You know, when we were all racing to who was going to land on the moon first. Right now, we're seeing a very different kind of race. It's not just symbolic in nature, but it also has huge implications in defense, in culture, society at large. There's about 18 countries that have national artificial intelligence strategies. Canada has a plan. India has a plan. And there's several other countries in Europe. You know, Europe as a bloc has several countries that are working towards this. But then the question becomes, you know, what about emerging economies? Not everybody can afford to. For example, you know, African countries. The answer that I would have for those countries, they can't afford not to be part of this. Maybe they won't have the same capacity to invest the way the United States and other superpowers or global powers are investing. But at the same time, there are global dialogues going on where developing countries can participate in, especially when it comes to how we govern AI. And this will eventually become a very big issue at the United Nations and other international forums.
In an attempt to play catch-up, the Trump administration recently launched an AI initiative. But the US continues to lag behind on many other fronts. Aus Haidari has our 5 facts.
America's share of global wealth is shrinking. At the end of World War II, the United States accounted for half of the world's economic output. By 1985, it had fallen to 22.5%. Today, it stands at 15.1%, and the IMF projects that it will slip to 13.7% by 2023. By comparison, China's share has been steadily rising, overtaking the US in 2013 and is expected to break the 20% mark by 2023. National debt in the United States stood at nearly $22 trillion by the end of 2018, more than $2 trillion higher than when President Donald Trump took office. The total debt stands at 78% of the country's GDP. That's the highest it has been since 1950. The US has the highest income inequality of all rich countries. In 1980, the bottom 50% of the US population had more than 20% share of the national income, while the top 1% had just over 10% share. Over time, that trend reversed. Today, the top 1% controls more than 20% of the national income, while the bottom 50% has only 13%. More than 40 million Americans live in poverty. The US has one of the highest poverty rates among wealthy nations at 12.3% of the population, which means more than 40 million Americans are living below the poverty line. US academic achievement and healthcare access lagging behind. Internationally, the US stands 24th out of 71 countries in science and 38th in math. As for healthcare quality and access, the US ranks 29th in the world, behind most countries in Europe.
The US under Trump has also been gradually losing its political clout and influence on the world stage. In this new multipolar world, how is the US president's approach to foreign policy affecting America's global standing? And who will fill the new leadership void left by the United States? Joining me now are Vali Nasser, Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at Brookings Institution, and Fred Fleitz, President and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. He recently served as Deputy Assistant to President Trump and Chief of Staff to National Security Council Advisor John Bolton. Fred Fleitz, looking at the US's standing on the world stage, a domestically weakened Donald Trump went all the way to Hanoi to meet with the North Korean leader. He came back empty-handed. Many people argue he came back demeaned. To what extent was this miscalculation? Was it failed brinkmanship, or is it further proof of the US's decline on the world stage?
Well, it's good to be here, and I agree with what you said about the rising power of China, but I completely dispute the whole thesis of this panel. I think we're learning from Donald Trump that a weak and indecisive United States, which we had under Barack Obama, is extremely destabilizing. President Trump has reversed that by being a decisive president with the use of force on the table. He's gotten rid of the terrible nuclear deal with Iran.
Forgive me to interject, but he is the one who started the whole war rhetoric with the North Koreans.
Exactly,
it wasn't President
and that
Obama.
rhetoric got the North Koreans to the table, lowered tensions with North Korea, stopped its nuclear missile tests, and I have to say the president's decision to walk away from the table in Vietnam was an act of leadership that showed the North Koreans we will only settle for a good deal. I think we came out looking very good from the Vietnam summit.
Do you agree, Vali Nasser? Did the U.S. come out looking very good? Many people would argue that no progress was made whatsoever, that President Trump actually came back empty-handed.
Well, I think the certain taboos were broken, like the meeting of the heads of state. But I think the expectation for that there would actually be a deal was never realistic. The North Koreans were not going to give up their entire strategic asset in one meeting in exchange for just economic relief, which the U.S. could reimpose at any moment after they'd given up their nuclear deal. So President Trump basically set himself up for this outcome. You might say that it's a good thing that he didn't agree to something that would have been problematic, but I think going in, people were extremely skeptical, particularly in the region, that this would actually lead to a deal. The option would have been for him to try to arrive at some steps that would have meant that we may give a little bit and they might give a little bit.
Fred Fleitz, you've been highly critical of the whole Iran nuclear deal that President Trump walked away from. Does the president, though, really know what he is doing? Because when you look around, he seems to be isolated when it comes to Iran. Everyone else is still on board. The Europeans certainly are. He walked away from a deal that everyone else still believes in.
Gulf states are with the president. Israel is with the president. And
the Gulf states were never part of this deal, but the Europeans were, and they still are part of it.
Why weren't they part of this deal? They're in the region. You know, when the Clinton administration negotiated the agreed framework, South Korea and Japan were at the table. This deal was negotiated with states thousands of miles away from Iran. Well, not Russia. Russia borders Iran. But regional states weren't included in the deal. The deal was a disaster. It did not significantly stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. The fact that President Trump killed it is one of his biggest achievements as president.
Killing it, was that because of the whole nuclear threat that Iran represents, Vali Nasser, in your opinion? Or does it speak to something much larger? Does it speak to the US president's willingness to perhaps in some respects do the bidding of the Netanyahu government and their Saudi allies in many respects in the region?
Well, ultimately the Republican Party was never in favor of a deal, but the deal should be much bigger than domestic American politics. This is a deal that the United States entered in. It actually reflects the credibility of the United States. Why would the North Koreans sign a deal with any American president if the next president can come in and just undo the deal because he didn't like it? And the deal was actually, it has been verified that Iran has abided by the terms of the deal as was negotiated and signed and then made into a document of the United Nations by the United States. So it makes the United States essentially look like it cuts a deal, it doesn't like the deal after it's cut, it moves out, and then that basically it has no credibility to agree to other deals.
Looking at the bigger geostrategic picture, is there a consistent US foreign policy to speak of? Because a lot of people looking at this precisely see that the US isn't willing to engage with Iran, but yet is willing to engage with the Taliban, a group that the US has been actively engaged in a war against for the past 17 years. Is there any consistency
the US is
to US
willing
foreign
to
policy?
engage with Iran. Iran does not want to engage with the Trump administration because it wants to stick with this incredibly generous deal that the Obama administration agreed to give Iran. And I think it was important that the Trump administration kill this deal, increase sanctions on Iran, and create the environment where someday we can negotiate a meaningful deal that addresses all the threats Iran poses, not just a nuclear
clearly
program.
the Europeans don't agree because they're putting together a mechanism to circumvent US sanctions.
The mechanism is a
Vali
joke.
Nasser,
European countries are not...
Your take on this?
Well, they may not be able to implement the mechanism, but it's very clear that the United States is isolated. But the United States took a resolution to the United Nations and made this into a binding United Nations document. So it's an international document. The United States was the sponsor of it. This is not coming down to a partisan argument. A Democratic president signed a nuclear deal that a Republican president doesn't like it. If you're sitting out in the world, you would say, you know, why sign a deal with the United States? The next president would come in and say, well, I don't like the nuclear deal that Trump signed. I'm going to reverse it. So we have to show some consistency from president to president on these deals if we're going to have more of them.
Some consistency, Fred Fleitz, beyond the US administration's approach to North Korea and Iran. Would you agree, would you accept the notion that any superpower cannot afford to be erratic? And I think you might agree it's been the hallmark of the Trump administration. He himself vowed to be unpredictable, and on that, he kept his pledge.
The president inherited a number of messes around the world. In North Korea, concerning Iran, in Iraq, and in Syria, the terrible Paris Climate Accord. He's had a lot of problems to deal with. And I think he's plowed through them very carefully with some expert advisors. My former boss, John Bolton, is one of them. I see you have him behind you there. He's getting expert advice on how to deal with these problems. But, I mean, it's been an uphill struggle. Think of the policy in the Middle East leading from behind, how this encouraged al-Qaeda, how this encouraged rogue states to take advantage of the United States and the Middle East. The president had to reverse this, and it's been tough.
Vali Nasser, is China taking full advantage of this? Is it the case that while Trump continues to make headlines, China is making headway all over the world?
Well, there's a lot of pressure on China on the trade issue, but by scuttling the trade agreement in Asia, we've opened the door for the Chinese now to enter into a very different trade agreement with all the Southeast Asian countries. We also have lost our credibility there because a lot of countries put a lot of capital into getting that trade deal, and President Trump scuttled it. There's no successor to it. There's no talk of a trade deal. Everything is bilateral with different countries. And as a result, you know, there's not just unpredictability. There's a belief that the United States is vacating certain arenas, and the Chinese are moving into it. The Russians are moving into it. It's actually not true that in the Middle East the threat of war is on the table. The U.S. is withdrawing from Syria. The U.S. is withdrawing from Afghanistan. The president has made it very clear that he didn't support the maximalist positions that the Bush administration took on by going into a war in Iraq. I don't think actually that the tough rhetoric necessarily is matched by commitment to being present in large troop numbers in areas of the world or building multilateral alliances around countries like China or Russia. I think countries like China and Russia are actually feeling a lot of room to maneuver. And the collapse of relations between the United States and Europe is also seen by both the Chinese and Russians as providing them with additional opportunities. So it's a very different world. It may work for the Trump administration, but a lot of the cordons that existed around these countries is no longer there.
Certainly a vacuum is being created,
Well,
and many are willing to jump in.
No,
we have 10 seconds
I don't
left.
agree with
in
any of that.
10 seconds.
Well, I'd say in Asia, we're far more credible with Japan, with South Korea. They know we're standing up to China, especially on trade. I simply don't agree with that at all. I think that this president's credible and is making a real difference in promoting international security.
Fred Fleitz, Vali Nasser, thank you both very much indeed.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
So with this shifting geopolitical landscape, the United States is certainly no longer the world's undisputed superpower. China's moment has come, and with the resurgence of Russia on the international stage, other powers are pursuing new strategic alliances. They're also gaining more political and economic influence. By 2030, 7 emerging economies, including India, Indonesia, Turkey, South Africa, and Brazil, are projected to be among the world's top 10 economic powers. From me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next week.